A new poll shows a majority of Americans think President Trump is hindering the country's coronavirus response. A Quinnipiac University poll finds 62% of respondents say the president is hurting efforts to slow the spread of COVID-19, compared to 31% who think he's helping. At today's White House briefing, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany appeared to place the priority on reopening over following science.
Yeah, the president has said unmistakably that he wants schools to open, and I was just in the Oval talking to him about that. And when he says open, he means open and full, kids being able to attend each and every day at their school. The science should not stand in the way of this.
Boston Globe Deputy Washington Bureau Chief Liz Goodwin joins me now. Her latest article for the Globe is headlined, "Trump is projecting a sunny vision of a vanquished virus." But as case counts rise, that strategy is crashing into reality. Welcome, Liz. Great to have you with us. So what is the White House's strategy on dealing with the coronavirus?
Well, I think there's the White House's strategy and then there's Trump's strategy. And sometimes that's part of the friction we see. But the president, from the very beginning, has downplayed COVID-19. And I think part of that is his laser focus on the economy. So it took him a while to embrace social distancing at the beginning of the crisis. And then as soon as cases started to decline, he was pushing for an aggressive reopening timeline, sometimes against the recommendations of his top advisors. And since then, now that cases have gone up again dramatically in a worrisome fashion in a lot of states, the president hasn't shifted his tone at all. It almost feels like he's operating in an alternate reality where there isn't a pandemic. If you look at his schedule this week, he had an event celebrating law enforcement officers. He had the one we just saw today on deregulation, and he has one on infrastructure. I mean, those are all important issues, but at a time when the country is struggling so much with this disease, it feels really off. The tone is really off about it. And I think what he doesn't realize is that you can't really fix the economy without fixing the virus. And that's something that is just a problem as he's running for re-election. It doesn't really work to just ignore it.
And we are seeing this conflict play out within the administration. Dr. Fauci was recently publicly undermined by the president's trade advisor. The president himself refuses to definitively say people should wear masks, even as some governors loyal to him mandate it in their states. So when it comes to the specific issue of addressing the rise in coronavirus cases, what is the response to that from the White House?
I mean, there's effectively been no response from the president to the rising cases. What they say is, okay, that's not great or ideal, but the death rate isn't so bad right now, which obviously Dr. Fauci and other experts outside of the White House will counter and say, yeah, the death rate lags case counts. So you don't want to lull yourself into a sense of false complacency and say, well, deaths aren't as bad as they were in April or May, because that's usually something that happens a month or so after case counts start to rise. So yeah, it doesn't really seem as if there's a sense of alarm or urgency at all coming out of the White House on these rising case counts. And I think that's why you see the president's approval rating on this issue plunge, because a lot of Americans are concerned that they aren't seeing that sense of urgency or alarm.
I'm glad you brought up approval ratings, because nearly a third of Americans say the president's COVID-19 response is actually hurting the effort. Slightly more respondents say they don't trust the information Mr. Trump is providing about the virus. So even if the president is publicly dismissing the polls, as we've heard him do, he is clearly paying attention to them. So do you think at some point these rising negatives will force a pivot?
I wonder. I mean, you would think that the rising negative started a few weeks ago, so you would think you would have seen the pivot by now. But it did take President Trump a very long time to react to the initial crisis of coronavirus. If you remember, in March, people were really raising the alarm, including scientists within his administration. One of them, Nancy Messonnier, was retaliated against for saying, this is a really big problem. This is going to change people's lives. It took him at least, I would say, 5 or 6 weeks in April to adopt the strictest measures that people were promoting. So it's possible that we will see a pivot as cases rise. I think, from what I can tell from his rhetoric, he won't really change his tune until deaths rise, because that's what the White House keeps putting out as the only metric that matters. And that's very tragic, because obviously once you see deaths spike like that, people have died. Like, the whole point is to prevent that from happening.
Right. And we are seeing the deaths beginning to rise in some of these hotspots. So, Liz, one of the experts you spoke to says the president has, quote, tried to hedge his bets with his communication about COVID-19. How is that playing out, and how could it ultimately impact the election?
Yeah, this expert, he's actually a misinformation expert, and he was saying that when he analyzes the president's rhetoric around coronavirus, he feels like he tries to have it both ways, where he'll sort of wink at outright conspiracy theories sometimes around the virus, especially on Twitter. He'll, he compared it to the flu, which has a much lower death rate for a very long time, weeks and weeks. But then at the same time, sometimes he'll say, I embrace these strict lockdown measures, and doing that saved me 3 million lives. Or, like we saw last weekend, he was finally photographed wearing a mask, showing that he's taking this preventative measure. So it feels like he's trying to sort of hedge his bets, so that if the virus were to have, say, mutated and gotten weaker before election, he could say Democrats were being way over the top, and look, I'm the one who got the economy back open, and now the virus isn't a big deal. But if that doesn't happen and the virus is here to stay, which is what most experts believe, then he can say, well, I did do that initial lockdown, or look at these comments. But I think if you look at how people are feeling right now about the president and about coronavirus, it's not working. People are looking around, they're seeing the higher case counts, and they just want the government to do something and fix that problem.
Liz Goodwin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.